Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session on I Want It Now, a look into home delivery and the particular issues that we have with it, particularly during the lockdown period. My name's Tom Cherrett. I'm a Professor of Logistics and Transport Management within the Transportation Research Group at the University of Southampton, and I'm joined by my colleagues Andy Oakey, who's a PhD student, and also Sarah Wise from University College London, who will be joining us and giving contributions to this talk and a bit of a live demonstration as well as we go through. Next slide, Andy, if you can do it. This is all part of the Science and Engineering Festival, which is happening at the University of Southampton as a virtual event this year. So we're all very pleased to be trying some of this new tech out and seeing how we can deliver some experiences for you. So this is one of the talks that we're doing as part of this. Festival is going all from the 5th to the 14th of March, and lots of other events for you to get involved with. Next slide, Andy. I'm just going to advance the slides now, and then we'll be able to start.
There we are.
Here we go. Yeah, so can you go back one? We'll just start at the beginning if we can. There we go. Right, what's coming up? So this particular talk is entitled I Want It Now, which is all about our love affair with home shopping. And that has obviously really come to the fore as a result of COVID. We're ordering even more. So I'm going to kick off by talking a little bit about some of the challenges in meeting the demands of home delivery and how the delivery companies are actually adapting their operations to do this. My colleague Andy will talk a little bit about some survey work that we've been doing, looking at the changes in people's purchasing habits. What have we been doing during the lockdowns that's different, and how has that impacted on logistics? And then Sarah will show you a little bit of work where we've been trying to understand what are the wider implications of that. So, you know, you may be getting, as I am at home, many more van deliveries of parcels per week. What is that like for everybody else on your street? And what does that do for the carriers who are trying to deliver it? So that's kind of what we're going to cover, and we'll take questions and things as we go through. Next slide, Andy. So a little bit of background, looking at what the real impacts on urban delivery have been. And one of those is the growth in e-commerce. You know, we are, even before the pandemic, we're ordering a lot more things online. It used to be about 18% of total retail sales was what we were buying online. Through the first lockdown, that went to about 35%. So, you know, I needed a new clutch for my aging Mitsubishi. Very easy to source. I can get it next day. But the reality of that for the parcel delivery companies is kind of what you see on the right-hand picture on the screen. It's very intense work, and we're going to try and get that across to you in this particular talk. Next slide, Andy. So the other interesting issue is this notion of free delivery. You know, that's the one thing that I think the logistics industry would love it if the word free delivery was banned, because there's no such thing as free delivery. We as consumers are kind of detached from the actual cost of the delivery because it's not transparent in the purchase price of the product we're buying. You know, and that's a very interesting argument. If we really understood what the true cost of, say, same-day delivery is, we might think differently. Next slide, Andy. So the other interesting element is, you know, around now about 50% of homes, this is obviously before the pandemic, are empty during the working day because we're all should be out at work. We've obviously been working at home. So failed deliveries hasn't been such a problem over the last 12 months. But typically there's two issues. Around 50% of packages are not compatible with a standard letterbox anymore. That's something, a memory card I received on the left-hand picture there. That's the box it came in. You know, how do we receive our packages? And you will have all experienced failed deliveries, when you're not in, potentially where they've gone to, and how to try and get repatriated with your packages. Next slide, Andy. The other really key issue in dense urban areas like our big cities is it's the actual problems of making the delivery, because we've got more ultra low emission zones coming in. We've got the impacts of diminishing curbside space, because quite rightly we're looking at new ways, you know, of increasing walking, increasing cycling, and increasing the use of public transport. So in actual fact, it's actually quite hard to deliver these days. Give you an idea, UPS presented a very interesting presentation a few years ago where I think it was in 2018, they incurred just under $18 million in parking fines just trying to deliver in New York alone. So, there's a lot of issues in just trying to make deliveries in urban areas. Next slide, Andy. And there's also a lot of competition. So this is just a snapshot of, some of the major delivery companies that you will have noticed. There are many more than this, but there's a lot of competition, a lot of people trying to do the same thing, the same time of day, working in the same areas. And that's one thing that we've been doing in our research over the last few years, is to work with these companies to better understand what the implications of that are. Next slide, Andy. This is a little simulation that we did. It's actual real data. So this is from 18 parcel carrier vans working in one area of London in one day, working out of 3 depots. So the little tiny square is the vehicle, the round dot is the driver, if you can make them out. But this just, if you watch it over time, this is one day's activity. You see the level of replication going down the same streets at the same time. So the average driver here is trying to deliver about 130 parcels in the day. They're driving about 7 kilometres, but the reality is the driver is walking on average about 10 kilometres a day. And the van is parked and stationary for 60% of that time. So they're not really delivery drivers, they're delivery walkers. The interesting thing is that this little graphic here only represents 7% of the parcel vans that would have been operating in that area of London during that day. So you can imagine the extra activity that's going on. And it'll zoom in a second and you can see this kind of the impact of this everyone to everywhere culture. So, we wonder why we've got a lot of congestion on streets, and it's because of this dense activity. So the thicker the lines there, that shows how many times, vehicles are traveling on the same road. And a lot of the drivers from the different companies all know each other because they're all in the same area at the same times of day trying to serve the same customers. So it's are there better ways of doing this? And we'll come on to that at the end. Next slide, Andy. The other thing is delivery it's a very complex task. It doesn't sound it really, but the slide on the right here is a parcel delivery van round from one depot in London. So you can see the driver there has laid out all the parcels and they're kind of in postcode order. So he's laid them out in a kind of street order and he's loading that into his van to then make deliveries. And that's the outcome on the left. So there's an awful lot of local knowledge needed by drivers. The driver has to understand and learn the patch that they're in, where the people are, what's the best way of driving around it. So local knowledge takes about 6 to 9 months to develop for one particular area. Next slide, Andy. And the other thing is in dense cities, so this is London, this is where we put altimeters on some of the drivers to understand how much time they spent in buildings. So in a dense city like parts of inner London, drivers can be spending 23% of their round time up inside buildings trying to find people to deliver to. So, there's a lot of interesting understanding there about the dwell time of vehicles on street and the impacts of having to service high-rise blocks of flats. Next slide, Andy. This is an interesting little animation. So this is again where we were tracking drivers in London. That is one drive around there. It's about 1.6 kilometres square. And this was a courier driver who had a lot of experience, who'd been working for this company for about 3 years. And this individual had learnt this patch in real detail. So you'll just see that this is actually speeded up, but this is the driver going round his actual delivery round. And the things you notice about it is the driver doesn't actually replicate any roads. He's found a way of delivering to all the people in that area. He's probably got about 130 packages to deliver. And he's got a way of traversing that patch in the most efficient way. He knows all the best places to stop. He knows where the parking warden's potentially going to be at any time. He also understands how to potentially walk through buildings to get to other sides, to service other buildings. So there's he has a very intricate knowledge of the surrounding area. And basically, from day to day, the familiarity level, the round is about 80% the same. So they've learned a way of doing it. Next slide, Andy. We'll see if this one works a bit better. This next slide is an interesting one. It shows basically an unfamiliar driver. We're just going to try and reshare. We've got a little problem with the slides there.
1 second.
Yeah, it's all right. We'll get it back again. Technical hitch. But the really interesting part of this sector is the amount of what we call novice drivers. So particularly with lots of gig workers delivering parcels, one interesting issue there is how much familiarity do they have with the neighbourhood, and what does that do in terms of adding to congestion? Lots of unfamiliar people trying to understand how they get from one place to another. So this next little slide we've got just actually shows a driver who was standing in for somebody else on holiday, and what the level of difficulty was with that in terms of trying to find their way around. Here we go, it should be coming up. Right, here we go. So this driver is again starting from the bottom of the screen, but their delivery round is in the north part. So they're going over the River Thames and they're delivering in that just north of the Westminster area. So it's around the Smithfield markets. Here we go. So the driver goes over. We'll just wait for him to set off on the round. So again, very unfamiliar. He's standing in for another driver who happens to be on holiday. So you'll see doing a few deliveries before crossing over Westminster Bridge, and then you'll see the resulting chaos. Now, the interesting thing is this round would have taken about 9 kilometres in terms of efficient driving. This driver did about 20 kilometres because a lot of the time they're just desperately trying to work out where they are, and more importantly, where the actual consignee, the person they're trying to deliver to, is actually located. So they're trying to circulate to find parking spaces. So you'll see the driver here going around Smithfield Market again. You'll see this several times. They are unsure as to where to park, what the parking wardens, but then finally, where exactly is the consignee? They've got a postcode address. They've got to try and find that. And all the time, the van is parked on street, and quite often they will incur the parking fines and have to pay them. So, yeah, and if lots of people are exhibiting this behaviour, it means there's a lot of inefficient driving, adding to congestion, adding to parking problems. They're going around Smithfield Market again. And if we play this for a length of time, you'll see them go around about 10 times. But it kind of just gets the message across that there's many different people doing this type of work who maybe are not fully familiar with their environment and move from different patches from one day to the next. But there's a lot of inefficiency in this last mile delivery network. Next slide, Andy. So last bit for me, just to finish on this introduction, really. So it's what we call last mile challenges. That's what the term is about how we deliver to people. So increasingly complex demands. I mean, many of you are probably getting same day delivery as standard, but there's now, next day delivery as standard, but the same day delivery now. You can order something in the morning and have it delivered in the afternoon. The other key thing is lots of delivery companies over the years in our big cities, they don't have the depots they used to have. They've all been sold off. So what we call the stem mileage, driving in from outside, is greater. So there's always a pressure there to try and get the deliveries done within the time frame. So we wish we had more drop-off points within our urban cities as well. And there's increasing congestion anyway, and driver retention is an issue. And that little picture on the right is just for one parcel delivery company. It's those little paddles are just the numbers of deliveries they've made to individual households in 1 week across different little layers within that area, 9 separate patches. So it shows everyone is getting parcels all the time, and that's even more so with obviously the pandemic and us all ordering more at home. So that's a little intro, and I'll hand over to Andy now just to talk a little bit about some of these interesting studies that have been done to look at our behaviours during the pandemic and during the lockdowns.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'm going to take you through some survey work that we've been doing during the pandemic, looking at the 3 stages of lockdown that we've all been through, and we're still going through at the moment. So we've actually done 3 separate surveys, the first of which we had about 600 responses, the second just under 200, and then the third we had about 130. And the way we did this was looking at inviting the people that had taken part in the first survey to carry on into the second and third, so we can really understand how people's behaviours change over time. So let me take you back to the 23rd of March 2020, back when the first lockdown began in the United Kingdom. So thousands of people were stockpiling, and it really changed our way of life, this lockdown. So in our survey, we actually found that 66% of people were actually buying more than usual of all the blue items on this list here. Particularly things like canned goods. We've actually got almost a third of people were actually almost stockpiling these goods. Now, this results in scenes a bit like this. Now, this is actually a photo I took in Sainsbury's in Portswood, Southampton last year. And this is actually meant to be the loo roll aisle. And as you can see, it's completely bare. Now, the really interesting thing here is there isn't necessarily a shortage in the actual supply chain, but it's the challenge of addressing that and how you get it to the shelves and to the customers at their homes. Now, on top of this, we've also got people changing how they're doing their everyday life. So things like fitness, working from home, how they entertain themselves. And we've actually found that 1 in 3 people made additional purchases during the pandemic so that they could do these activities that they would normally do outside of their homes. So if we actually look at this word cloud here, this is how people described how they bought these extra items. Now, the key things that actually stand out for me here are home, delivery, and Amazon. And to me, that's a real given that all these extra goods are being shipped directly to people's homes, and there's often very little consideration as to the effect of that. So let's have another look at a scene that's fairly typical nowadays. So this is a street in London where we've got multiple different carriers trying to compete for this curbside space to reach their consignee. So I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 vans just in that small area. And you've also got the commercial sort of goods as well in this particular setting. So let me take you through the sort of changes that we had going on with respect to groceries. So on this graph here, on the left-hand side, we've got the frequency that people went to these different shops or used these different outlets. So if it's 1, it's once a week. If it's 2, it's twice a week. If it's 0.5, it's every other week, that sort of thing. So as we can see, before COVID happened, we had a lot of people favouring the large supermarkets and the small supermarkets with very little interest in other areas. Now, as we go into the first lockdown, things start to change. Obviously, we've got that stay-at-home order, and people perhaps a little bit afraid of the COVID virus, as they quite rightly should be. But the sort of tendency towards other modes or outlets rather begins to grow. Now, the one interesting area we've got is this growth in other grocery, we've termed it, and this is where people are perhaps looking at using wholesalers, which can no longer serve cafes and restaurants, and now they're looking to supply consumers directly. So as we go into the second and third lockdowns, we can see it's fairly similar across the board. And using some sort of intentions from our last survey, we can actually, to a certain extent, predict the behaviours for what we're terming the new normal. So as we can see, the new normal is a bit of a balance between what was happening before and what was happening after. What was happening during the third lockdown. And it's really interesting to see what's here to stay. So if we look at this as a percentage change, we can see that the large supermarket, it was hit, and it does look like there's going to be a bit of decrease. Likewise with the small supermarket. But if we look at grocery deliveries, people are using these far more often. So in the third lockdown, it was almost 100% up on where it was before COVID happened. Now, if you look at click and collect, this saw a real boom in the second lockdown. It slightly tailed off in the third and going towards the new normal, but there is a certain indication that this is a behaviour that is really going to stick going forward. So that's the sort of, you drive in, you pick up your goods, you drive off, or you might go into the administration desk at the front of the store, but there's very little actual interaction with the supermarket. Likewise with other groceries, we're looking to see a sort of sticking of these new behaviours. And external groceries, Interestingly, during the first lockdown, there was a real surge in what we're calling external groceries, and this is where people were looking to help support others in their community. So people like volunteer grocery supermarkets. We've also got communal shopping. But did that community spirit fade away somewhat? So as we look in towards dining, we begin to see a slightly different trend. So obviously, during lockdown, no one was allowed to eat out because all the restaurants were closed. But that did not stop our hunger for our cooked meals. So, as we can see, the takeaways and local takeaways for collection saw a bit of a growth going into each stage of lockdown. And the overall dining out type regime didn't really change. But as we go forward into a new normal, we're looking at largely a return to eating out, but there's still a certain amount of this new home delivery that we're looking at. Now, there's one thing that is really unknown about this at the moment is what this impact has, because when we're all at home sitting with our smartphones and we press, right, let's buy that burger for delivery, do we think about what's really happening? Is it going to be a single man in a car with just one meal? Do we have a real thought or concept of that environmental impact? So if we look at this as a percentage change, we can see that local collections haven't changed hugely, but delivery options have really grown, and this trend towards home delivery is quite key. Now, eating out obviously fell down, and it looks set to stay slightly down from where it was before COVID. But on the whole, takeaways are really starting to surge up. Obviously, this is a prediction based on people's intentions, and it doesn't take account of things like eat out to help out and these sort of ideas, which may well skew how we behave. So now we'll come on to consumer goods. So this is anything to do with things like your laptops, phones, it might be bedding, it could be clothes, anything that's not to do with your general food and dining. So before COVID, there was a bit of a balance between the high street and home deliveries, a little bit of lockers and attended collection points as well. But then we saw this growth in the online shopping and home delivery skyrockets. So as we go into the second lockdown, we can see people ordering online nearly three and a bit times where they were prior to COVID. And this growth we've got to really account for in our logistics networks. So after Christmas, the demand drops off slightly. But we can see this new growth in what we're calling the attended collections. I'll come on to that. So that is things like this, these click and collect points or perhaps parcel shops. So as a percentage change, we can see the high street is down slightly. Lockers, so that's things like your Amazon parcel lockers that people like to use when they're perhaps on the way to work, via the train station perhaps. These saw a bit of an impact, but they look largely to stay the same. Now, home delivery went up massively, and there's a bit of a suggestion that this is going to drop off a fair amount after the third lockdown, but I'd be interested to see how true that prediction is. Now, attended collections, these have had a bit of a surge during the second and third lockdowns. Again, they look set to drop off, but are certainly higher than where they used to be. Now, what this is really a big problem for is what do we do in these areas here? So Tom showed us a visual earlier of some of the activity on the streets of London. So if we think about all those extra unmarked vans that we've now put onto the road where, say, DPD, your Hermes, they've now got to get these extra hire vehicles because they don't have the demand themselves. They're going to force themselves into these areas, and that's just going to highlight these lines even more and create this additional overlap. And it could spell disaster for our road networks. particularly as we start to go back to work. Now, one idea that we've got to combat this is called portering, which essentially decouples the driver from the delivery system. So Sarah's going to take us through this in a bit of the modelling that she's been doing in her work. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Andy. I'm now sharing the slides. Are you able to see them? Excellent. So the way that I'm going to proceed is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the simulation that we developed in order to understand better the potential impact of portering. This is a kind of simulation called an agent-based model. And essentially what we've done is we've taken a map of the environment that we're interested in understanding how delivery might happen. So what you can see here is that we have both the road network with an understanding of which roads are larger and which ones are smaller. We also have this context and this information about where buildings are. So what we do is we take our information that we have about how the demand for parcels happens relative to buildings, and then we'll generate a series of parcels. So we'll say that a particular building has ordered a parcel and it wants to be delivered to this location. We'll generate a series of parcels for the whole area. And then we'll say, all right, these are going to be delivered, and all of these will be delivered to their target locations from a particular warehouse. So we send all the parcels to the warehouse. From the warehouse, we take our sets of parcels and we cluster them into smaller groups. So we say that each set of parcels is going to be part of one of the rounds, as you saw in Tom's presentation. We'll assemble a set of drivers, and for each given driver, we will associate them with one of the sets of deliveries that they're going to make. From there, we go and the drivers will calculate routes through the space. So they, based on their set of parcels that they have, they'll make decisions about where they should go, in what order, in order to make these deliveries for the environment. So what that looks like in context, it will depend a little bit on whether the drivers are in vans, whether they are portering. So if a driver is taking a van, obviously they'll be able to carry relatively more parcels and they'll be able to move more quickly throughout the environment. On the other hand, a porter won't have to take the time to do something like parking, finding a parking space. So they have fewer items, but they can also move more freely through the environment in that context. From the model, ultimately what we can kind of generate is an understanding of what the road usage looks like. So we can get statistics about things like how many deliveries were made, how far people walked, how far people drove, but we can also understand things like the relative impact on congestion on different roads, the relative impact on sort of footfall data on different roads, and also things like where vehicles have stopped and for how long. That can be particularly useful because vehicles stopping and starting has a large impact on the environment. So it's something that cities are often quite interested in, understanding where vehicles are spending a relatively longer period of time. So just to give you guys a sense of what this simulation might look like in context, I'm going to include here an example of the modeling that we did for the Southampton area. For the East London area, rather closer to me right now. So what we're doing here is I'm going to run the simulation a few steps, and you can see, if I zoom in on the simulation, that we have a couple of little drivers. So the pink is the driver, and in this case, the purple indicates that they have a vehicle that they're associated with. And over time, they'll move down the road, and they'll pick up their goods at the depot, and then eventually they'll move into the city and they'll start carrying out this series of deliveries. So if I let the model run for a little bit, and if I zoom in again, you can take a look and you can see where this driver, for example, has gotten out of his vehicle and is now taking the parcels around and delivering them in this particular area. So what we've done here is I've colored each of the parcels that are delivered based on which round they're a part of. So for example, at the end of the simulation, you'll be able to see that red was delivered by this nice driver with the traditional name 45673E15. Whereas blue was delivered by some of his friends. One of the things that we also keep track of during the course of the simulation is what times agents are walking versus what times they are driving. So right now, everyone is sort of getting out of their vans and doing this walking. In some cases, they only have to walk quite a short distance. Perhaps they've parked right in front of the building, and so they just get in and out with the time cost associated with that. In other cases, the walk will be quite a lot longer. So if, for example, sometimes we'll get a parcel that is randomly delivered to, say, one of these buildings, in which case, because the vehicles are associated with the roads, they'll travel to the nearest point on the road and then have to leave the vehicle on the road and go inside. So if we let the model run a little bit further, we're able to see over time how much time they're spending in these contexts. Ultimately, we calculate information from these sort of revealed possible routes about things like how long how long the vehicle's been parked, how many parcels are delivered, how far they're walking, how far they're driving, how long it takes overall. And you can also look at sort of aspects of the impact on the drivers. If I very quickly hide the visualization and it runs a little bit faster, we can show it again and you can see the progress they've made in the meantime. And over the course of the day, we'll get an understanding of how far they can go. So one thing you can also do here that's kind of pleasant is you can change in an interactive fashion how many parcels there are in the environment that they're being asked to deliver. You can also change things like how many drivers there are or how many porters individually are coming through. So you can, at a fleet level, experiment with the relative investment in resources. How many vans would you like to do versus how many employees would you like to do? So that's something which, if you guys would like, we're able to take the model and actually change something like the number of parcels that are being generated relative to the buildings. I might ask either Tom or Andy if there are any comments from the audience. Right now, we're saying that buildings will generate something like 4 deliveries maybe every week or so. Does anyone have a suggestion of, a number, how many per week? Yeah.
I'll kick you off. So I think,
hit me, Tom.
Between lockdown last time and lockdown now, so I'm probably getting double the amount of parcels. So you could say, in a week, I'm probably getting about 8 at least for our household.
All right, excellent. I'm going to go to my simulation, and I'm just going to change the number of parcels a pop relative to my weighting parameter, and I'm just going to run this again. Oh my goodness, how exciting. It decided to take this moment to share that with us. All right, so we're going to run this again. Apologies for the delay.
The interesting things there, that's one of the fascinating bits, is thinking that, how many deliveries are you getting as an individual in your household and how it's changed, but what is everybody else on your same street doing it? Are they doing the same as you? And that's the beauty of this type of tool. It helps you to see, wow, what is the collective impact of all that new activity on the street? That's the really powerful thing. And it helps policymakers understand, the need for provision of facilities to assist in delivery, particularly if this trend goes on.
One of the things that I think is also quite interesting is that a lot of courier companies have taken a very traditional approach to the way that they separate out the different locations where they do deliveries. So Tom, you talked about how drivers will have a patch and it will take them 6 to 9 months to become familiar with the patch. So those patches tend to be relatively static. You'll have a sort of area that someone is responsible for. However, one of the things that we could kind of do with a simulation like this is explore whether there's particular groupings of space where it's actually really more efficient based on the road network, to have one patch be the area that someone is making their deliveries versus another patch. So, for example, in this model, as time goes on, you can see that I've just clustered them into sort of relatively small squares of space. So they're squares, and it's quite similar to the postcodes, but it's a little bit distinct. But so that's something where we can experiment also with how do you create a patch? How do you set this up most optimally for drivers versus potentially cyclists versus pedestrians? I did a piece of work later after we had built this with a company that was doing cargo cycles, and they were especially interested in how they could understand at a fleet level what their individual drivers were doing, which was quite interesting to me.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff.
So, this code, if you're interested in it, it is all available online if you fancy. So,
okay, so thanks. That's a good little introduction to the problem. So, Andy, we could switch over to the other slides now and just talk about what the implications of this are. So, I think it's very useful to show, what's been, and on many streets the numbers of independent delivery personnel has increased dramatically. So, as Sarah was saying, one of the interesting things that is looking at how companies are adapting to these circumstances, because a lot of the major delivery companies, particularly, obviously Hermes being one example, some of their volumes have gone up, 60% on a day-to-day basis. So they've had to make huge adaptations, and just thinking about how you can serve urban areas. So one of them, as we were saying, is portering. This idea of going back to a system we had, 300 years ago, where you're looking at humans to deliver parcels. And so armed with things like these 200-litre hockey bags, you can get, about 25 to 30 parcels in there. Now, obviously, the interesting thing with lockdown is we're buying more stuff online, but we're buying potentially bigger stuff, all different types of things that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And that's one of the big challenges for logistics companies. So where you've got a van, as Sarah was showing, doing a lot of traditional delivery, what a lot of companies are now looking at is reducing the number of vans, but rendezvousing on street with people, with walking porters. So like things, if you can imagine your Deliveroo, your Uber Eats, but those guys not only doing food delivery, but also parcels. So the concept with portering here is that you're decoupling driving from walking. You're pre-packing bags of parcels for specific areas, geographical areas. And it particularly works well in dense cities, obviously. And then the driver will meet a porter, give them a pre-packed bag, and the porter will go around and deliver those parcels. And then either rendezvous with the van in a different place, or potentially you could put a group of parcels in a drop-off point, and porters can go back to that point to pick up. Some of the work that we were doing with carriers in London showed that on some rounds you could reduce the numbers of vans needed, in one case from kind of 7 down to 2. So you'd use 2 larger vans, but you'd have, instead of 7 vans, 2 vans, and maybe 2 to 3 porters on street. So it's reducing CO2, it's reducing the amount of miles travelled, but also it's a good way of meeting customer needs in a slightly more efficient way, because you haven't got a van waiting on street while the driver is trying to find the individual. So it's a very interesting thing. It can reduce, as we said there, curbside dwell time. So that's the amount of time a van is sat by the side of the road, by about 80%. The key problem with this, though, is the sortation process, because in every parcel depot, you're sorting via a round for a driver, but also you've got to think of sorting to a sub-round for a porter. So really, and this is the crux of the problem, you need to know the weight and the size of the parcels in advance. And surprisingly enough, that's quite a challenge. A lot of systems, we don't really know that in detail. If you know the weight and size in advance, then you can sort for walking porters or cyclists at the same time. So it's an interesting issue. Next slide, Andy. So there's walking porters, but the other thing, and this is really taking off, you're going to see many more cargo cyclists. They've sprung up a lot. They're in use all over Europe, and there's different types. So that top right picture is a system, it's called the Armadillo, by a company called Vilove, and it's a quad bike, but it's essentially, it can take just over a meter cubed box on the back. The boxes can come off and be separated. It's obviously pedal assist. electric, and you can couple up trailers to it. But some of the large parcel companies are looking at using that type of system. The good thing about these is they can go in cycle lanes. They're about 0.85 meters wide, so they can go into cycle lanes. But it's an interesting user debate. Would you want that type of thing in a cycle lane if you're a cyclist? How do you see around it? But it's a very interesting concept of how to serve people in urban areas in a different way. So the bottom picture there is another bit of work we did a few years ago with TNT, see FedEx now, and that was in Brussels, where it was a mobile depot. So if you can imagine, delivery companies will bring in a big trailer, they'll park it somewhere, and obviously they need the consent from the council to do that, but then electric bikes and maybe porters will come to that trailer, get loads, go and deliver them, bring returns back, and then the whole thing goes out at the end of the day. So it's just interesting thinking about how we can use urban space more effectively to do deliveries. And some of that is and particularly, as we're moving to low emission zones, we're looking at, congestion charging, etc., and potentially restricting freight vehicles going into urban centres. We have to think more smartly about, with the increase in parcels that we're demanding to be delivered to home, we need to think more smartly about how we deliver them. And that's another one interesting idea. Key thing with electric bikes, though, is it like this: where do you store them? You've got to charge them. You've got to think about storage facilities and the implications of that as well. Next slide, Andy. Yeah, so this is another very interesting idea. It's it's not rocket science, but concierge services. If you live in a big tower block in a city, and that's one of the really interesting issues. How many deliveries are made to some of the large residential developments? Loads of couriers desperately trying to find people in blocks of flats, and we had first-hand experience of doing that with some of our trials in London. If you have a manned reception facility, you can leave parcels easily. A driver can leave parcels with a reception person, and then they consignee can pick them up. The interesting thing is, should we be thinking about the new developments in terms of planning, that systems like this should be made mandatory? Should you have to think about how you're going to cater for parcels being delivered? And that doesn't have to be a manned reception. It could be lockers within a building, but thinking about, obviously when we all get back to work potentially, and we're not all at home after lockdown, people will not be in during the working day again. So we've got to think smartly about how we might better equip some of our new buildings to receive more parcels. The other really interesting thing about this is personal deliveries to workplace. So I'm sure some of you have had things delivered, which is for your own use, but delivered to work because you're going to be there. And there's not a lot of research really regarding the true impacts of personal deliveries, but a lot of companies have been banning them in big cities because obviously it's not part of the workplace activity. From a sustainability point of view, if we're all at work during the day, it's a good place to have parcels delivered to, because it means a van isn't going to our house when we're not in. But that whole issue about how we deal with personal deliveries to workplaces is another interesting kind of dilemma. Next slide, Andy. And so I'm sure a lot of you have used these locker boxes. Amazon have lockers. Many outlets, they've been used by different supermarkets for click and collect, etc. Very convenient. They're used for business to consumer products, but also business to business as well. They're open 24 hours, 7 days a week. All based on the kind of left luggage lockers that you have at airports. Have been very successful in terms of security, etc. But they're very good for the parcel industry because it means a driver can easily access them. They can be put in places where potentially there's drop-off facilities, parking areas. They can easily be loaded, but they can be used for returns as well. And that's another interesting side issue about the current state of play is we're ordering more product, but we're going to be sending a lot more of it back. And we have to think about how we repatriate parcels when they go back through the system. Obviously, you need to think about the land areas. Where do you put these? Do you put them inside buildings? Do you put them outside? Where's the best place to locate them so you potentially don't have lots of people arriving in cars to collect from them? But the other thing is, it's an added service. So Amazon, if you've got Prime, etc., they're a standard part of their delivery system, and they've been very successful. But if it's an independent locker company, how does that work in terms of the transaction with the retailer? So they've been very successful in what we call business to business transactions earlier, where service engineers who are going out to a company to maybe mend a piece of equipment, they can have parts delivered to the nearest locker in relation to where the service is going to take place. And that's where they've been very successful from the outset. Next slide, Andy. Some more interesting things. Now, some of you may have used things like Amazon Key. Lots of interesting ideas for allowing delivery companies to get access to maybe your house, your garage, your shed, or even your car. So there's been lots of experiments. Volvo, Audi, a lot of the car companies have experimented and are experimenting with delivery to boot of vehicles. So the concept there is that a parcel, you're expecting a parcel from a company, and that's the interesting thing in the kind of new leisure environment we might find ourselves in. You might be out for a day out, you might be ordering product while you're out doing whatever you're doing. What about the concept of having that delivered to your car while it's stationary in a car park for 6 hours or somewhere? That's the kind of concept here, using your car as a potential delivery point. That obviously entails the delivery company getting access to be able to unlock your car to put goods in it. Now, that's quite a controversial thing, and it's something that obviously users are quite concerned about, but it's a very interesting concept. You've got to remember that a lot of cars are stationary for 80% of the day. They're not doing anything. They're either at your home or potentially your place of work. But thinking of them as a mini reception point is quite an interesting concept. But likewise, there's lots of systems designed to enable you, the customer, to allow a delivery driver access to maybe your shed, your garage, etc. So one-way access systems for safe, secure delivery. And that gets around these problems of failed home deliveries, which obviously have been a significant issue, and again will be once we get out of lockdown. But yeah, it's just a very interesting kind of concept for alternative delivery mechanisms. Next slide, Andy. Sarah mentioned this, and so did Andy, but collection points. So, I'm sure a lot of you have used Local Collect or, other parcel collection networks where you have something dropped off at a local corner shop, which has a service, and then you go down to pick that up at a time that's convenient for you. So they're commonly known as collection delivery points, CDPs. And they can be in a variety of facilities that, again, open quite long hours, some of them, and can be very convenient. And again, with the portering concept, this is an idea for how we could service urban areas, because carriers could take bags of pre-packed parcels and leave them at collection delivery points for porters to come and pick them up. And I think that's one of the interesting prospects in the future, is that we might have a lot more community engagement with things like delivery, which we've obviously experienced and Andy touched on during lockdown. So local people doing errands, but doing part-time work to do deliveries and servicing within their community. And that's an interesting idea. So Parcely, there's lots, Collect Plus, Hubbox, there's lots of companies who are doing this type of activity, but running them out of established retail settings. So your corner shop is also your collect point for your goods. And when you go in there, you might buy some extra items in the corner shop. So some interesting ideas in which we can use things on a community setting. Next slide. So the other interesting thing is, how we might move to autonomous delivery systems. So some of you may have seen these. This is the Starship droid, which has been around for a number of years. And this is in Milton Keynes. I was on the way to a meeting and it was delivering someone's breakfast at the time. But this isn't far-fetched anymore. There are many systems like this, and Starship have had this system for a number of years. There's some more on the screen there. For those of you interested, look up Neuro and UDelv in the United States, where they're doing a lot of grocery delivery now by autonomous vehicles. So the concept that we can utilize some of these systems quite effectively to make deliveries, and particularly it's been looked at in the food sector, going from, and in America, particularly in residential areas where people have got driveways, etc., and not so much in dense urban areas. But this is working and has been working in the centre of Milton Keynes for quite a while. But just interesting, these systems obviously rely on the consignee coming to the curbside to pick up the actual delivery, which is the key thing. So it relies you coming out of an office to pick up your goods. But will we see many more of these? But what are some of the issues? people falling over those on the pavement, how do they negotiate their way around, etc. Will people intercept them, and will there be theft, except things of that nature? But in some of the trials, they've been quite successful, and they've been quite well received, and lots of the parcel companies are experimenting with the use of droids to make deliveries in this setting. Next slide, Andy. Another interesting one for the future. Well, is it really the future? Because we're starting to experiment with the use of drones, but particularly for medical logistics. We've been doing work in the area with the Isle of Wight, looking at the scope for moving things like patient diagnostic samples, certain medicines between pharmacies and clinics, etc., to assist the National Health Service. So there's many examples around the world. Zipline, Matanet are doing a lot of zipline, particularly in parts of Africa. It will be interesting. Amazon have been experimenting with this. There's lots of systems out there to deliver potentially packages to your door via drone. Obviously, lots of interesting user group issues with those, people's public acceptance of it. But certainly in the medical domain, there's some significant interest in the take-up of potentially drones to assist in patient care. Lots of issues with what we call beyond visual line of sight. And I think one of the key areas here going forward really is related to how do we effectively manage drones in amongst crewed aircraft. So traditional aircraft and uncrewed aircraft in shared airspace. And you need a traffic control system that can handle both types of aircraft. And that is something, obviously, that a lot of research is embarking on at the moment. But some interesting ideas there. Next slide, Andrew. And the final one, really, and this is something that is very interesting, really, and there's a very good example of it in Scotland, but it's called the carrier's carrier model. And this is where, and it goes back to some of those slides we showed at the beginning, all that spaghetti, all those vans trying to get into the centre of a city, all from different companies, all trying to do the same thing at the same time on the same streets. What if they were all to work together and actually maybe provide their parcels to a third party who then drove them in on their behalf? So it's this concept of, okay, so you might have one van which has got UPS parcels, DHL, FedEx, etc. in the same unit. This is one system that's been done in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland by a company called Menzies Distribution. They've been doing it for many years. So the Highlands and Islands, you've got, I think, 89 inhabited islands off the coast of Scotland. And traditionally, anyone on those islands could get the phone out, buy it now, I want this parcel delivered. That would require all the different carriers to, in making deliveries to very far-fetched and often quite rural places. The concept there is that Menzies have developed a system whereby all of those separate rival carriers can deliver their parcels to Menzies, and they distribute them on behalf of those carriers. And they've been able to come up with an IT system that can essentially, it's quite simplistic, but it can read all the separate barcodes from all the different carriers and still give them that privacy of their data connections to them. And it's a neutral livery, so it's, you don't know it's a UPS parcel within there. It's just a Menzies vehicle that's delivering on their behalf. And so you're drastically reducing the numbers of vehicles that are actually needed. And that we're thinking about that in reverse. Should we be doing the same thing to deliver to our bigger cities? Now, obviously, the supermarkets are doing full loads and are working very well and efficiently at that. But when you're looking at smaller item delivery, particularly in parcels, is that something that could be effective, particularly with low emission zones and that type of system coming into play? So it's a very interesting concept. So that brings us to the end of what we were talking about. We're just interested to see whether anyone's got any questions, just looking at the chat, see whether anyone's got any particular issues they want to raise. I can't see anything else coming in at the moment. Andy, Sarah, anything else you'd like to kind of finish on? Any kind of tips and hints and food for thought about how things might progress in the future? Andy, do you want to go first?
Well, I think going forward from the collection point idea that you were talking about there, Tom, I think it'd be really interesting to see what the impact of those will be coming as we come out of lockdown, particularly where obviously people are going back to work and they're in and around these places which are being used day to day, and how that will be sort of more widely accepted.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, Sarah, anything else for you?
Well, someone has actually asked a question in the comment thread, which is quite exciting. So, which I can speak to, I guess.
Please.
Sylvie Tannel.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Writes, could portering interfere somehow with the plan of some companies to make deliveries faster, e.g., 1 hour delivery? And I think it's an interesting point. In a certain way, I would almost argue that it's the opposite. I don't think it would necessarily interfere, because if you're doing a portering approach, traditionally you'll probably also have other infrastructures such as light good vehicles. And wherever you're supplying it from, you'll probably also have heavy good vehicles somewhere in the system. So in a traditional sense, you could realistically send things out that weren't particularly urgent via porter. And then you could maintain sort of people who were associated with rapid response, and have them doing sort of the quicker deliveries in a more reactive fashion, rather than in the pre-planning that you had done earlier in the day. So it's in the same way that you'll have other products, other facilities where there's the reactive and then the sort of more long-term need. So it's very possible that you could actually see an increase in speed, or more freedom on the part of the vans to do that, because you wouldn't have a van tied up doing the same route all day long.
Of course, as we go forward, there's going to be a real shift towards multimodal as we look to move away from fossil fueled vehicles. So the cargo cycles and drones that Tom was talking about, they perhaps might be servicing these faster, more urgent loads, and then you might actually use the porters to do some of the slower loads.
Portering has definitely shown to be quite a bit quicker, as have cargo cycles, in terms of servicing areas. It's just quite flexible. The key thing with it, though, is a lot of it's around the security. If you're creating other drop-off points, you've got to think about the one thing about the way the system works traditionally is that the courier company have, until you sign for the parcel, they are in charge of it. The issue with this is you're handing over to other third parties all the time. So you've got that potential risk, even though I think the beauty of it, which has been shown in the gig economy work anyway, with the app, because you've got to demonstrate you've delivered it to that particular point, and that's how the whole kind of payment transaction works. But certainly, the portering that we've seen has been quite effective and fast.
I've got another question here. Has the simulation modelling work taken into account flows of traffic at different times of day? How does trying to get more deliveries done earlier affect the number of parcels you can deliver? That's from Who Cares, I'm Bored.
So Who Cares, I'm Bored, the data set that, so TfL released a traffic data set just slightly after I had finished programming the model, which irritates me to no end. So what I should say is, the model is designed so that, yes, you can absolutely put that information in. And you could theoretically also modify it so that the individual's route plan relative to the time of day, so that during certain times of day they would avoid certain roads, and in other times of day they would do other things. But yes, so currently what it includes is the actual traffic on the road. So if, for example, you have a lot of individuals who are on the same segment of road, it will slow down everyone's progress. But you could additionally also include external data about that to sort of increase the fidelity of it a little bit. And in terms of trying to get more deliveries done earlier in the day, yeah, you would be able to, depending on how you approached it, have perhaps a heavy goods vehicle of the type that Tom indicated, the pairing of the sort of larger sort of mobile depot with the smaller electric bikes, porters, this kind of thing. You could do the delivery of the large thing when traffic was low, and then have smaller, more mobile units moving when traffic is more costly. So absolutely, it's a great, these were both really good questions. And it's quite an exciting topic.
Great stuff. Thank you. I think we're virtually out of time now, because it's 7 o'clock. So, but just like to obviously thank everyone for participating. I hope that was of interest to people. It's, again, as Sarah was saying, it's a subject that's it's just going to get more and more intense, really, as we come out of this, and really interesting to see how, and the relationship with the high street is the most interesting thing, really, and how that is going to probably change still further. So yeah, we'll hope to probably come back with some more evidence and work with other people on this as we go forward. But But thank you all very much for joining us anyway. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.